There are many ways to die, but not all of them are as cruel and macabre as a prisoner dying in prison. Even more so when he's brutally murdered by one of his comrades. This is the subject of our story today, the terrible and mysterious death of a man behind bars. On June 23, 2012, a Florida prison activated its alarms after discovering the disappearance of one of its prisoners. Guards were about to take roll and count the inmates when they realized that one was missing, so they began an extensive search operation. The guards assumed he was hidden somewhere or that he'd made a mockery of the security system and had escaped. What they could never imagine was what really happened to that man, that he was truly missing. No, he did not run away as thought. This man was killed and boiled in hot water, as if he were a chicken in soup. So who was this man, and why was he in prison? His name was Darren Rainey, a 50-year-old African-American born on January 12, 1962. He was under arrest for possession of cocaine and had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for that crime. But this was not the only time Darren had set foot in prison. On other occasions, he'd served small sentences for his aggressive behavior. As a result of his untreated schizophrenia, Rainey was almost all of the time held in a transitional care unit, a place where he had his own cell while receiving psychiatric assistance, mainly antipsychotic medication. This type of cell allows the guards to constantly observe prisoners through a glass window in the cell door, so Rainey was perfectly monitored, which lends a greater mystery. If the man was under total surveillance, how did he get out of there? And how is it that no guards noticed? And why is it that after more than 10 years after his death, there are still unanswered questions which have made Rainey's family believe that the police themselves were behind the alleged mortal torture that ended this man's life? For this reason, we'll go after the clues to try to unveil what really happened to this prisoner and to find out who is responsible for his tragic death. Let's start by getting to better know the prison located in unincorporated county of Miami-Dade, about 40 miles south of Miami. It was opened in 1996 and houses about 1,500 inmates, all of them convicted in the state of Florida of numerous crimes, including inmates convicted of violent crimes and nonviolent crimes. It's a prison where everyone lives together regardless of the level of risk they have, except for inmates with mental problems who have their own cells within the psychiatric ward, just as Darren Rainey had. So we can assume it would have been difficult for Darren to have had enemies if he lived excluded from others in his own cell. It could also lead to suspicion that he was actually killed by the guards themselves. But the guards have their own version of events. According to them, on that tragic day, Darren was taken from his cell because of his fits of anger. He had filled the walls of the cell with feces and was full of his own excrement, so they decided to take him out and to the showers to take a bath. These were the same showers where, a few hours later, he was found without vital signs. According to the director of the prison, the event happened sometime during the shift from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. The correctional facility had an excellent security network that included several officers, even up to a sergeant, who were specifically in charge of the west wing of the transitional care unit where Darren was detained. These officers would divide their tasks, one of them being responsible for counting inmates every half hour, and according to the executive director, Cornelius Thompson, that same day around 6:30 p.m., Darren was checked in his cell and nothing unusual was noticed. Everything was going normally with complete tranquility. But this tranquility was ended shortly before 7:30 p.m., when a guard making his rounds noticed Darren Rainey livid and noticed that the inmate was going out of control. He waited a while for Darren to calm down and then took matters into his own hands. But Sergeant John Abanika realized what was happening and immediately demanded that Clarke and other officers take Darren out of his cell and escort him to the showers. He also assigned someone to clean the cell walls. From that point on, Darren Rainey took the road to a savage death as the guards moved the inmate to an adjacent building. But the strange thing was that they took him there to take a shower, as there were closer bathrooms where Darren could have washed himself. Perhaps the officers had something else in mind, the torture of the inmate, as Darren was taken to a location next to a janitor's closet, which had a special feature. From the janitor's room, the guards could control the flow of water and the temperature of the room. A room that was out of reach of any other inmate, making it nearly impossible for him to call for help. Perhaps it was a guard who put the water at high temperatures in order to scald and murder Darren with boiling water. The officers denied any involvement in the death of Darren, saying that it was an accident. One of them said he put Darren in the shower, then went to the janitor's room to turn on the faucet from there. He then got a piece of soap and took it to Darren to clean himself, also commenting that Darren was a man who did not like to bathe and had a history of refusing to wash himself. That day was no exception, because when he handed him the bar of soap, he was shouting, "No, I don't want to do this." Screams that guards ignored, leaving the area to get ready to fulfill other duties while Darren was left in the shower, locked in. Guards apparently forgot that they had left Darren locked in the bathroom, and it was not until 9 p.m. that another security officer passing near the bathroom noticed that Darren was still locked in the showers. The guard claimed that he heard running water and approached the showers and observed Darren Rainey standing near the door refusing to clean himself. Despite the fact that it had been more than an hour since he was introduced to the shower, he was still filthy in excrement and was reluctant to bathe and get rid of all the feces. So the guard left him in the shower to clean himself. At 9:30 p.m., however, a sergeant ordered that Darren be taken out of the shower, regardless of whether he was clean or not, because it was already so late. Officer Roland Clarke returned to the shower, turned off the faucet from the janitor's room, and opened the shower door. At that time, he found Darren Rainey lying on the floor on his back in the middle of the shower. At first, he thought he was joking, so he elbowed him with his foot in an attempt to make him react. However, he never responded. Immediately, the guard radioed for help, and medical assistants quickly arrived on the scene. They tried unsuccessfully to perform CPR, but it was too late as Darren was not breathing and almost without a pulse. Seeing that the inmate was not responding, officers Roland Clarke and Cornelius Thompson lifted him and put him on a stretcher to take him to the emergency room. Unfortunately, nothing worked. At 10:07 p.m., the prison medical staff declared Darren Rainey dead. According to the officers' version of events, the inmate died due to accidental asphyxiation due to the steam that had concentrated in the shower during the time he was locked in it. What they did not say was that the man had serious third-degree burns all over his body. The truth began to come to light on June 24, 2012, when Detective Wilbert Sanchez of the Miami-Dade Police Department arrived at the facility to begin investigating. Once inside the facility, Detective Sanchez began interviewing those who'd been there at the time of the death, an interrogation that included some of the prison officials and a group of nurses who had tried to save the inmate's life, one of whom had indicated the severe burns on Darren Rainey's body. It was impossible to ignore. The inmate's skin had begun to slide off a large part of his body, including his face, torso, back, arms, and legs. Practically his entire body was charred, the nurse said. So the detective realized that this case was far more involved than previously thought. He questioned the executive directors who oversaw that wing of the prison to ask them how no one noticed that Darren Rainey was burning, to which they responded that Rainey hadn't screamed or given any kind of distress signal. While they confessed that they had left Darren in the shower for about 2 hours with minimal supervision, that was the only thing they said they were responsible for. At this point, Detective Sanchez classified the death of Darren Rainey as an unclassified death that would require further investigation. He could not give a verdict without knowing what the results of the autopsy would yield, and thus be able to determine the true cause of death. During the investigation, Detective David Lillard, crime scene specialist, began taking photographs of Darren's body, as well as the locations in the prison where the inmate had been that night, to try and put together the mysterious crime scene that had ended Darren Rainey's life. Lillard also began to collect available evidence that unfortunately did not include the temperature of the shower water in which Darren Rainey had died, since the temperature of the water heater was damaged. Dr. Emma Liu, medical director of Dade County, despite seeing red marks on the skin, ruled the cause of death of the inmate had not been the result of burns, as he had no obvious external injuries. What became apparent was that authorities were manipulating the justice system to try to evade responsibility in the case. At that time, no one seemed to care about what had really happened to Darren Rainey. He was just one more statistic out of hundreds of deaths that occur in prisons each year. But what many people don't know is that many of these deaths are caused by the officers themselves. And though these officers tried to wash their hands and hide what really happened, they did not succeed completely, because, as the saying goes, between heaven and earth there is nothing hidden, and little by little different versions of what had really happened to Darren Rainey began to leak. One of them was thanks to the testimony of another inmate, Harold Hempstead, a white prisoner who had not stopped swearing and perjuring himself since Rainey died in the shower. Hempstead was serving a 165-year sentence for a string of robberies. Said Hempstead, subjecting inmates to very hot or very cold showers is a method the guards used to apply, and Rainey was not the only one to receive this punishment. Hempstead remembers how Darren shouted, "I can't take it anymore. I'm sorry, I won't do it again," while trapped in the shower. However, prosecutor Catherine Fernandez dismissed his account, considering it inconsistent, and closed the case without filing any charges. That ruling was based on the official autopsy, the results of which were delayed for 3 years, and established that skin detachments on the body were present due to the natural process of decomposition, not to thermal abrasion. And therefore, the 2 guards who had been denounced as responsible continued to work in the prison system, as if nothing had happened. Thus, the prosecutor had become complicit in denying the nature of the case, thus joining the side of the authorities who wanted to deny the atrocities that many prisoners have had to face in U.S. prisons. In fact, outside experts have evaluated the terrible images of Darren's corpse and maintain that it is irrational to deny the existence of hot water burns. In fact, one of the paramedics who treated Rainey the night of the incident stated, quote, "The inmate had 2nd and 3rd degree burns on 30% of his body." Meanwhile, a nurse on duty that evening, Brittany Wilson, wrote in her report that Rainey had 1st-degree burns on 90% of the body, and that there were burn marks that could easily be seen. Add to this the testimonies of several prisoners who, like Hempstead, affirm, quote, "The boiling shower is a practice of torture in the prison to discipline prisoners with mental illnesses, locking them under hot water without them being able to manipulate the shower controls from the inside, as they had been deliberately placed to be manipulated from the outside. So the officers who deny blame for Darren's death were using such a practice. Only this time they went too far." Brian Hernandez is an inmate released in February 2013 who witnessed what happened to Darren and said, quote, "That day Darren was taken to the shower early at night and left locked in there for an extended period. He was kicking the door and trying to escape his torture and screaming that he wanted to get out. Screams that were heard for approximately 30 minutes. The guards ignored the screams and only reacted later when Darren was already dead. When the guards were taking Rainey's body out of the shower, Hernandez commented that he saw pink flesh on the legs of the deceased inmate that stood out against his dark skin. So Dade Prison is or was a correctional facility where abuse was rampant, and it was not for nothing that from 2013, after Darren's death, Numerous complaints were filed with the Office of the Inspector General of the FDOC, Jeffrey Beasley. Complaints alleging that guards who worked in the Dade facility had subjected inmates to abuse that went far beyond the typical limits of prisoner punishment, including long-term deprivation of food and water, regular physical and sexual abuse by guards, and even attempts at torture. In fact, a psychotherapist who worked at the Transitional Care Unit, the same unit where Darren Rainey was housed at the time of his death, testified that he knew many of the guards inside the facility had a history of abuse. He also alleged that he left his post in 2011, a year before Darren was killed, because he was tired of so much injustice experienced there. At the time of his resignation, he sent a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice to point out that TCU guards regularly mocked, tormented, abused, beat, and tortured mentally ill inmates. He was sure that the statements of the inmates were more than true and fit in with everything he had witnessed when he worked there. He also believed that prison authorities manipulated evidence to prevent the truth of the Darren Rainey case from coming out. As of the date of Darren's death, the Dade Correctional Facility was a hell and butchery of inmates, holding more than 2,000 individuals in a facility designed for 1,500, and the number has been increasing. Perhaps the most appalling thing about the case is that none of the deaths of prisoners have a reasonable explanation. But apparently no one does anything about it, as accusations that guards abuse inmates were nothing unusual. But there was one complaint in particular which would stand out above the rest, which alleged that inmates were being locked inside a shower where guards could control the temperature of the water from an adjacent room. Guards often raised the temperatures to dangerous levels by using the shower as a makeshift torture chamber. These complaints were not accepted by the FDOC office since most of them were exposed by a single individual, Harold Hempstead, who, as we already know, had alleged the precise details of Darren Rainey's death. But according to Miami Herald reporter Julie Brown, he was not believed. Rather, he was branded as crazy. With the passage of time, his testimony was finally taken into account, thanks to the constant complaints of other abused prisoners, and that of the family that justice be done. 2 years after Darren's death, and after new information was collected, investigating officials tested the temperature of the water in the shower where Darren Rainey had died. According to research, the water could reach over 160 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause burns. But the prosecution continued to argue that the guards were not responsible for Darren Rainey's death. But the fact is, whether he died of his burns or not, those guards are responsible because the shower in which Darren Rainey died measures just 3 feet, not large enough for Darren to avoid being hit directly by the water. What prosecutors did not take into account is that the burns began on the feet through drops of water that splashed when falling. And the burns were not only caused by being in direct contact with the water, since they were also produced thanks to heat and steam that was generated in the shower due to lack of ventilation. If you take those facts into account, and the fact that guards locked Darren in a shower for more than 2 hours, that alone makes them guilty of negligence. And despite all this evidence, the guards in the case remain free without having received any punishment at all. In fact, 5 years after the death of Darren Rainey, the state attorney of Miami County and Dade, Catherine Fernandez, without giving in, published a 101-page report where she explained why none of the guards were responsible for the death of Darren Rainey. She concluded that the cause of his death was not burns, but rather heart disease. So why, if his death was due to cardiac arrest, did it take 4 years to give those results of the autopsy? A forensic doctor in charge of the case explained that over the past decade, there had been 174 deaths in local prison, and each had required its own separate investigation. However, according to the doctor, there were no signs of abuse in any of the inmates. As for the condition of the skin of the inmate, they ruled that the detachment that Darren presented was not due to burns but to friction, likely generated by the inmate himself during one of his schizophrenic attacks. In the end, the court ruled that the family of the victim be paid compensation of $4.5 million. But that money did not come out of the guilty party's pockets, but rather out of the pockets of taxpayer citizens who have to pay the price for the brutality caused by uniformed murderers. It is worth noting that this agreement was reached 6 years after Darren's death. In 2018, the Miami Herald wrote an article about Darren that made everyone's hair stand on end. Since the news outlet set out for 3 long years to investigate the abuse and mysterious deaths of detainees in Florida prisons, an article that soiled the morale of the prison system and compelled it to compensate Darren's relatives. But monetary payment is no justice. Justice happens when the guilty are punished for the crimes they have committed. But that's the penitentiary system that often preaches justice, but in reality ends up practicing injustice. For this reason, Darren's death remains a mystery, though there are certainly many loose ends. We can be sure that criminals who are also on the side of the law and wear uniforms watch each other's backs to deny the obvious and manipulate justice at will. And so we've come to the end of this video. If you liked it and want to continue enjoying more crime stories like this, subscribe and ring that notification bell so that you never miss one of our upcoming stories. For now, I say goodbye and I'll see you in the next one.